are continuing our series through the Gospel of Mark. And today we're going to be in chapter 7. And this chapter begins with another encounter that Jesus has with the religious leaders, in particular the Pharisees and the scribes this time. Beginning with Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through 13. Now when the Pharisees gathered to him, and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" And he said to them, "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men.' And he said to them, 'You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, "Honor your father and your mother," and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. But you say, "If a man tells his father or his mother, 'Whatever you would have gained from me is Corban,' that is, given to God,' then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, thus making void the word of God by your traditions that you have handed down. And many such things you do." For about 1,500 years, the Jews, when they spoke of the law, they mainly referred to the Ten Commandments and the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch. That is where God handed down the general moral law. And it was left for each person to take God's moral law and apply it to their life. Well, somewhere around 400 to 500 years before Jesus came, there rose up a class of Jews called the scribes. And they weren't content with just this general moral law. They wanted more details. They wanted a checklist. They wanted to have specifics that they could apply to every area of life. And since God didn't give them that, they decided to make their own. So they took God's general principles and they came up with specific rules and regulations for every possible action and every possible situation in life. So they developed these thousands and thousands of rules. And for a long time, they weren't written down. It was just oral law that was handed down from generation to generation. And this oral law was also referred to as the tradition of the elders. So that's what the Pharisees are complaining about here, is that Jesus' disciples weren't following those traditions of the elders. So the scribes really, they made the law, and then they interpreted the law, and they enforced the law. So they're kind of like Congress, lawyers, and the Supreme Court all in one. So they had all that power. So that's the background of the story of what's going on here as we begin chapter 7. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked Jesus, "Hey, how come your disciples aren't washing their hands before they eat?" And they aren't talking, I mean, that sounds normal for us, right? We wash our hands. We tell our kids, wash your hands before you come to dinner. That's not the kind of washing they're talking about. They're not talking about hygiene, right? They're not talking about bad manners or anything like that. This was a ceremonial type of washing. It really didn't do much in the way of cleaning the hands. They would hold their hands up and sprinkle a little bit of water on them, and then they would rub their fists into each palm. Then they'd hold their hands down and sprinkle a little bit more water, and then they were ceremonially clean, whether it washed all the dirt off or not. So they're talking about being pure before God as opposed to being hygienically clean. Jesus replies to their question by pointing out their hypocrisy. And that was the main beef that Jesus had with these religious leaders. Every time he encounters them, he brings up their hypocrisy. And he does so in this case by quoting from Isaiah 29, verse 13, where Isaiah is accusing the people in his day of honoring God with their lips, but their heart was far from him. And this is where the saying, paying somebody lip service, comes from. You know, you say it, but you don't really mean it. It's not really what's coming from your heart. You're just kind of putting on a show. And Jesus points out that in their way of thinking, it's okay for someone to hate their neighbor. It's okay for them to be full of envy and jealousy. It's okay to be full of pride. None of that matters as long as you wash your hands properly. So he's trying to point out their hypocrisy of their legalism. Legalism such as theirs focuses on the outward appearance or the outward actions of people without really considering the inward motivation or what's really going on inside. You may notice we have a new TV up here. This is the third TV. Because the ones that arrived looked great on the outside, but when we got to the inside, there was something wrong with them. The first one had some spots on it. The second one was totally shattered. So even though things can look good on the outside, but you need to inspect the inside. And of course, God is the only one who can truly inspect our hearts. But that's what Jesus is telling them here is what matters more is what's going on inside you, not whether you're following these man-made rules of sprinkling water on your hand and declaring yourself clean. And then Jesus points out that they have forsaken the commands of God for all these legalistic rules of man. Then he kind of turns his attention back to the people. So he makes his case to them, and then he turns and he continues the same train of thought, but now he's talking to the people. Let's look at verses 14 through 23. And he called the people to him again and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him. But the things that come out of a person are what defile him." And when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable. And he said to them, "Then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled?" Thus he declared all foods clean. And he said, "What comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person." So here Jesus begins by kind of making a very profound and shocking statement for that culture. He says, nothing outside a person, there is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him. And that statement went against everything that the Jew believed and was raised to understand. For generations and generations, you look at the book of Leviticus and it lists a whole bunch of different foods that you can't eat. And for years, Jews had chosen death rather than defile themselves by eating unclean foods. But Jesus tells the people that it's not what you bring into your body that defiles you. It's what comes out, because what comes out really reveals your heart, what's going on internally with you and your relationship with God. And really what he's saying is nothing really can be unclean but people. Because it's out of our heart that these evil things come about. You know, we can go through all of the rituals and put on a facade and look holy, but it's what's really going on inside that God looks at, and whether we are truly presentable to God, whether we are truly in a relationship with Him. Now, for Christians, you know, we don't really have the food taboos that Jews do, but we have our own ideas of how things should be, our own little man-made rules, unwritten rules that we have and we apply to one another. You know, oh, as a Christian, you shouldn't do such and such, and you shouldn't dress like that, and you shouldn't do this and that. I remember when we first moved here, we moved here so I could pastor the Norwood Christian Church. Before we moved, I bought a 2001 Chevy pickup truck, because I knew living here I'd need a truck. And it was about, the only used truck I could find in our price range. And it probably wasn't the truck that I would have picked, but it was about the only one available. And it had lifters on it, so it looked sweet. It was a sweet ride. 2006, end of 2006 is when we moved here, and it was a 2001, so it was 5 or 6 years old and had 180,000 miles on it, but it looked nice. So once we got settled and I started visiting people, I went to visit this couple, and the first words out of her mouth was, "Wow, that's a pretty fancy truck for a pastor to be driving." And I looked, and I don't remember ever seeing anything in here about what a pastor's allowed to drive. But we have these little ideas of what people are supposed to do. Somehow, in some people's mind, the type of car you drive says whether or not you're a good pastor or not. My brother, Don, ran into a similar thing, and it was worse for him because a family actually left the church he was pastoring because he drove a convertible Mustang. And the husband or father of the family told him that they were leaving because a convertible Mustang was not the type of car a pastor should be driving. It's a sinner's car. It's a playboy's car, and he would not attend a church where the pastor drove a Mustang, a convertible Mustang, no less. So we all have our own thing. We apply these man-made rules to each other. So I think there's an application for us here. Legalism looks at the outward appearance. Legalism looks at our outward actions, where God looks at what's going on inside. Moving on, verses 24 through 30. And from there he arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And he entered a house and did not want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. But immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." And she went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. So Jesus was looking to get away and take a break. So he left the region of the Jews and went off into the area that was predominantly Gentiles, trying to get away from the demands of the crowds and the religious leaders and all that stress and conflict that he ran into every time he hooked up with them. So he went off to the region of the Gentiles. And he entered a house in hopes that no one would know he was there, and then he could get some rest, maybe spend some time with the disciples, and kind of get away from the daily demands of healing that he was running into. But even there in the land of the Gentiles, people heard about him. People knew who he was and what he could do, and they found him. I think Mark makes a profound statement that we need to think about. He says, Jesus could not be hidden. That is so true. If Jesus is active and involved in your life, you can't hide it. Jesus cannot be hidden. He makes himself known. So if people are surprised when they hear that you're a Christian, something's not quite right. You've been hiding Jesus. Jesus can't be hidden in our lives. He shouldn't be hidden in our lives. It should be obvious that we have a relationship with him, that we belong to him. So word gets out that he's in the area, and this Gentile woman comes to him. And this exchange that Jesus has, it makes Jesus look harsh from our perspective and the language that is translated for us here. Because the Jews had a derogatory term for Gentiles, and that was dog. And it says that basically Jesus refers to this woman as a dog. But there's two different Greek words for dog, and the derogatory one was like a wild dog. Chris, what was the word you gave me today? The feral cat. What's the equivalent? Cur dog, a wild dog. It's also the word used for a female dog, that B word used for a female dog or a cantankerous woman. That's the one Greek word. Jesus didn't use that word. He used a more gentle word. It was like a pet or a lap dog or a puppy. That's the word that Jesus used here. So he's not really being mean to the woman, but he is acknowledging that there's this cultural division between the Jews. And he says, I need to feed the children first. So he didn't really outright tell her no, right? He said, my main purpose in coming is for the Jews. So it's not right for me to give what is meant for the children, the Jews, to the little puppies. But this woman, and he said first, he didn't say no. First I have to feed the children before I care about the puppies. And this woman takes his analogy and just gives it right back to him. And yes, but even the puppies get to sit under the table and catch the crumbs. And see, by saying that, she's showing her faith in Jesus. She knows that Jesus has enough power to go around. There's going to be leftovers, and she is more than willing to take the leftovers from the children because she knows there are plenty. And Jesus rewards her for her faith and says, you can go home. The demon has been removed from your daughter. And she goes home and finds that she has been healed. Her daughter has been healed. Wrapping up chapter 7 with verses 31 through 37. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, to the region of the Decapolis. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, which that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. And Jesus charged them to tell no one. But the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, he has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. If you get a map of the Middle East in Bible times, the route that Mark describes that Jesus took to get back to the Decapolis is a strange one. because Tyre is on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, and Sidon is up north along the coast. And then coming down to the Sea of Galilee and the Decapolis is way southeast, inland. It'd be like for us going to Montrose, and to come home, instead of coming straight home, we'd go up to Junction and then down through Gateway and around the back way. But scholars have estimated that trek by foot especially would take about 8 months. So Jesus was in no big hurry to get back home. He took this time. We're not told what happened, but it looks like he took time to be with his disciples, to train them and prepare them for what was about to happen once they got back into the region of the Jews, around the Sea of Galilee and the Decapolis. When he did finally get back, of course, the people heard he's back, and they start bringing people to him again, and they bring a deaf man to him and one who had difficulty speaking. And Jesus healed him. But the way that Jesus heals him tells us a lot. It shows the compassion that Jesus had. The man was deaf. And in that day, and I think even today, deaf people are easily embarrassed about their disability. Because when you think, if you hook up with somebody who's deaf or hard of hearing, what do you do to try to communicate with them? You yell. Yeah, you raise your voice, you shout, you try to, thinking that if you speak louder, they'll hear you. Well, that draws attention to the person, and it just kind of points out their disability, so that they're easily embarrassed in group situations like that. So the first thing Jesus did was he took the man away privately, and he was going to deal with the man in private so that the whole crowd isn't around seeing this. And it seems strange to us that he would stick his fingers in the man's ears and then spit and then touch his tongue. But this, again, is showing compassion. The man is deaf. Jesus can't tell the man what he's going to do, so he uses his form of sign language to explain to him what he's going to do. So he puts his fingers in his ears to tell the man, I'm going to restore your hearing. And again, it sounds gross to us, but in that day, they believed that spittle had curative properties. And so he spit, most likely spit on his finger and then touched the man's tongue to show him, I'm going to give you your speech back. It's not those acts that cured the man, right? That's kind of his communication. This is what I'm going to do. And then he takes a deep breath and he sighs and then commands man's ears and mouth to be open. So it's through the power, Jesus' power of his speech, his word, is what healed the man. But the fact that he took the man aside and took the time to kind of explain what he was going to do just shows the compassion that Jesus had on this man. And then when the crowd finds out that the man's been healed, they go crazy and they can't keep their mouth shut, and they go tell the world. But they do say something interesting. They say, speaking of Jesus, Jesus has done all things well. And that reminds me of what God said about Jesus. In Genesis, after the creation, after the sixth day of creation, God looked at all that he had made and said, it is very good. It was very good until man's sin ruined it all. And then the plan of salvation is working its way out, trying to reconcile us with God, trying to bring God's beauty and love back into our lives. When Jesus was baptized, he came up out of the water and God said, this is my Son in whom I am well pleased. Jesus does all things well. He is at work in our life, reconciling us with God. He is doing a good work within us, bringing us back to God, reconciling us with him. Jesus wants to cleanse us, but not the way the Pharisees say you have to sprinkle ourselves to cleanse our hands. He wants to clean us from the inside out. He is doing a work in us, perfecting us, bringing us to Christ-likeness, so that Christ isn't hidden in our life, so that he is seen and that others are drawn to him. He is cleansing us so that we can be reconciled with God. Jesus does all things well. And he will continue to do things in our life until the day he calls us home. We are continually being reborn, reshaped, remade in the image of Christ. He does all things well. Is he at work in your life? Are you hiding him, or are you letting him have his way in you, cleaning you up, molding you, like that song that we sang about? Is he at work in your life?